Well, good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us for the latest installment of our Tewksbury history series, How Parts of Tewksbury, Chelmsford, and Draycote Became Lowell. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Friends of the Tewksbury Library, the Tewksbury Historical Society, and the Pollard Memorial Library in Lowell. When Lowell received its town charter in 1826, the community was much smaller than it is today. The original geography of the town consisted of today's downtown and the Acre, South Lowell, and Lower Highlands neighborhoods. Over time, the state legislature annexed portions of Chelmsford, Draycote, and Tewksbury to Lowell, doubling the city's area. Tonight, we're joined by Middlesex North Register of Deeds, Richard P. Howe Jr. for a virtual presentation on the 4 different annexations of land from Tewksbury to Lowell, as well as the annexations involving Chelmsford and Draycote. Dick will describe how the Tewksbury land appended to Lowell, the political process for these annexations, and the reaction of residents of all the communities regarding these actions. So Dick needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Dick served as Register of Deeds of the Middlesex North District since 1995. He holds a JD from Suffolk University Law School and an MA in History from Salem State University. He is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer and the author of several books on the history of Lowell. So all of us here live and those that will watch on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dick for joining us here tonight. And Dick, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Robert, for that very kind introduction. And also thank you, Bridget. And thank you all of the attendees for joining us tonight. It's great to have such a substantial crowd. Registers of Deeds don't tend to draw big audiences. So this is very gratifying. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk a lot about the geography of Lowell and the surrounding towns and how that changed over time. Because as Robert said in the introduction, the original grant of land for Lowell was a lot less area-wise than the city that we know of today. And I'm going to try to take you through the different chunks of land that were annexed to Lowell by using maps and pictures. Because in the many years I've been registered deeds and also a practicing attorney before that, I found that one of the biggest challenges with land records is taking a description on a piece of paper or a line on a piece of paper and translating that to a point on the ground. For instance, people will often come in and say, I'm having a dispute with my neighbor, or I want to put up a fence. I'm not sure where my boundary is. I need a copy of my plan or my deed. And we can give them that, but unless there's some stake in the ground or some kind of concrete marker or some permanent boundary line in the ground, it's awful tough to take that description on a piece of paper and translate it to that known point on the ground. So what I've tried to do in my presentation is use pictures, contemporary pictures of places that would constitute the corner boundaries of the different parts of Lowell. But really, to understand Lowell, you have to go even further back in time. And for that, I'm going to go back to the 1600s. And we're going to start with this map, which is an early map of this area. And it's going to require some explanation by me. And so this was drawn sometime after 1655. And it shows the Concord River in its center coming from south to north, and the Merrimack River running across the top. So this point where I put this blue arrow that says confluence of Merrimack and Concord Rivers is exactly where the Lowell Memorial Auditorium now sits. So it's just behind the auditorium that the Concord River flows into the Merrimack River. And this map is further annotated to the east of the Concord River, Billerica, although it's spelled Bilrikye. And then over on the east side is Chelmsford, and there's the word north. But in here it says India land. And the Massachusetts General Court, which was the colonial legislature, it wasn't a state legislature in 1655, granted town charters to a group of men from Concord and Woburn who had come up the Concord River and settled here. And so the legislature is the entity with the authority to set the boundaries of a town. And they granted a charter for this area and the people called it Chelmsford. But they also granted a second charter the same day, and it was for a town called Wamasett, and it took up the Indian land here, so-called. And that was because of this guy. His name was John Eliot. He was a minister, and he was from south of Boston. He was from Plymouth County. And in the 1630s, he had learned some of the Native American languages. And he took it as his life's goal or his life's mission to convert many of the Native Americans to Christianity. And so he traveled around Massachusetts, and he established a number of what he called praying towns. For instance, one is Natick, Massachusetts, but the other one was Wamasett, this one here, right, pinched in between Chelmsford, the Concord River, and the Merrimack River. And this town of Wamasett actually constituted today's downtown Lowell, the Acre, and the Lower Highlands. And this plaque, which was erected in 1930 on the 300th anniversary of the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it's right in front of the Eliot Church on Summer Street in Lowell, right across from the South Common. And it says Meeting House Hill. This is the site of a chapel erected in 1663 for John Eliot, the apostle to the Indians. Here he preached to the Wamasett and Pennacook Indians, converting many and establishing a village of Christian Indians called Wamasett. So the people that came that wanted to settle Chelmsford, their initial petition to the legislature was for all of the land from the Concord and Merrimack westward. And they wanted it because the Native Americans had already cleared the land of forest. And that was a very labor-intensive thing to do back in the 17th century. But that's where John Eliot stepped in, and he really kind of stood up for the rights of the Native Americans. And the legislature, because they respected Eliot, granted these dual town charters to the two towns. And that's how it stayed from 1655 for another 20 years. And then you had King Phillips War. That started in 1675. It started down in Plymouth County in Rhode Island, but it soon spread up this way. It never actually reached Chelmsford or Billerica, but Groton, for instance, had to be abandoned because of attacks of the Native Americans. In fact, the militia from Chelmsford deployed to Groton several times, and so they saw some fighting. And King Philip's War is actually the deadliest war in the history of the North American continent in terms of the percentage of the population killed. It was brutal by both sides and for both sides, but the English ultimately prevailed. And in prevailing, it completely changed the attitude of both the English towards the Native Americans and the Native Americans towards the English. That kind of respectful relationship that we saw in 1655 when the colonial legislature granted a town charter to Wamasett for the Native Americans would not have happened then. And the Native Americans recognized that. And so their leader, whose name was Wanalancet, and this is not the spelling that we know of Wanalancet, but this is actually the language from a deed recorded at the Middlesex North Registry of Deeds, dated November 18th, 1685. And it was from Wanalancet. It says, "Know ye that Wanalancet, the only son surviving of old Pas Conway, deceased, who was the great and chief sachem upon the Merrimack River." And then it goes on to say, "In consideration of much love and kindness, together with many gifts already received, grant this land to Thomas Hinchman of Chelmsford." Now, if I can give a plug for the Registry of Deeds, if you go to lowelldeeds.com and follow the search functions, you can find this document and every other document that's ever been recorded, going all the way back to the year 1629. That's our earliest record. And here's another example of a similar deed. This one says, "Know ye that Wanalancet sachem John Nofow, Joseph A. Line, and Simon Billiquim, Indians, inhabitants, and those that have a natural right to the land at Wamiset, which lieth upon Concord River and near Merrimack River, for and in consideration of £3, and also for much kindness shown to them, granted Jeremiah Bowers of Chelmsford." This was in 1686. So what happened was Wanalancet realized that the relationship with the English and the Indians, the Native Americans, had changed. And so he led his people up the Merrimack River into the forests of New Hampshire, where they settled down. So they basically abandoned the land that was Wamiset. But before they did it, Wanalancet signed these two and another deed that transferred that ownership of that land from him on behalf of his people to these guys from Chelmsford. Now, you have to keep in mind is that Wanalancet was not skilled in the art of drafting English deeds. So these were written by the Englishmen. And so they're very self-serving statements about for all the kindness shown were sort of thrust upon him. And it's questionable whether he completely understood the meaning of all the words. I think he understood he was transferring ownership of the land to the English, but as you probably understand, ownership is a completely different concept. So that's how things stood until 1725 and what I call the Stephen Pierce controversy. Stephen Pierce owned a farm in the former Wamiset area in what is now the Lower Highlands. This picture is taken on Plain Street. So behind you would be the Lowell Connector and the Target shopping center, the Lowell Car Wash. And this is looking up. Straight ahead would be Parker Street, and off to the right behind the Walgreens sign is Chelmsford Street and Powell Street, and the green building is the Laura Lee School. So this is the approximate location of Stephen Pierce's farm. Well, in 1725, the people of Chelmsford elected Stephen Pierce to be their representative in the general court. So he traveled to Boston when the legislature first sat, but his colleagues refused to seat him because he did not live in Chelmsford. He lived in this town of Wamiset, and that was not part of Chelmsford, so he couldn't represent Chelmsford. So he came back, explained what was going on. Nothing really happened. And then all of the people who lived in this Wamiset area refused to pay their property taxes to the town of Chelmsford. The town of Chelmsford prevailed upon the legislature to annex Wamiset to Chelmsford. And that's how today, if you ask people what was Lowell before it was Lowell, many would say Chelmsford or East Chelmsford. And that's not completely correct because it was once Wamiset. 1725, it became Chelmsford, and it stayed that way for 101 years. Now, these two photos to the right, the upper photo is Benjamin Pierce. He was the nephew of Stephen Pierce. He actually lived and worked on the farm. There's a famous story on April 19th, 1775, Benjamin was working in the field. He heard gunfire from the southwest, dropped the plow, grabbed his musket, and headed off to Concord and Lexington. At some point after the Revolutionary War, Benjamin moved to New Hampshire. He was very successful there. He became that state's governor, and his son, Franklin Pierce, became the 14th president of the United States. So we have this little game of trying to tie everything in the world into Lowell. So there's your connection between Franklin Pierce and Lowell. And so this is the Pawtucket Falls. It always didn't look like this before 1825. It wasn't as distinct a falls. There wasn't a dam there. But nevertheless, the Merrimack River dropped 36 feet in just a mile, and that the falls was an impediment to navigation. So if you were using a raft to bring stuff down the Merrimack from the interior of New Hampshire to get it out to Newburyport in the Atlantic Ocean, you had to unload your raft on the upstream side of the falls and then carry or drag the stuff to the other side of the falls, and then you'd continue on your journey. It was very inefficient, but there was no alternative. And then in the years after the American Revolution, there was a trend towards what were called internal improvements. We would call them transportation infrastructure projects. They weren't then railroad stations or airport terminals. They were canals. And a group of men decided to build a canal that went around the falls on the Merrimack River. And this is a map from 1826. You can see that distinctive northern bend in the Merrimack. Off to the right, the lower half of the screen vertically is the Concord River. And then this big U-shaped, shallow U-shaped thing at the bottom of the screen is what's known as the Pawtucket Canal. The Pawtucket Canal leaves the Merrimack just 50 yards to the upstream side of the Pawtucket Falls, right where the Lowell Motorboat Company is and what I would know as Burbeck's Ice Cream near the South Campus of UMass Lowell. And then it follows the natural terrain. There was a pre-existing brook and some other terrain features. And it arcs through the today's acre neighborhood, but back then it was just sort of farmland and meadowland. And then it flows out into the Concord River. And along the way, it used 4 lock chambers. This one is the guard locks. It's the place of the Francis Gate to handle the change in elevation of the river. And it was a transportation canal, and it was very successful because people would pay to put their boats through it and they wouldn't have to unload and drag the stuff on the other side of the falls. And the Pawtucket Canal was a private business concern, but it was not a monopoly because a few years later, a competing canal called the Middlesex Canal opened. That also left the Merrimack River on the upstream side of the Pawtucket Falls, right where Hadley Field is in Lowell today. That's where the Middlesex Canal came off the Merrimack. But instead of rejoining the Merrimack, the Middlesex Canal went all the way to Boston and where it joined the Charles River. So you get a lot more for your goods in Boston than you could in Newburyport. So the Middlesex Canal drew off all of the traffic from the Pawtucket Canal. And it basically went out of business. It still sat there. It just wasn't used very much. And that was the case up until just about 200 years ago next month. And that's because of this guy, Francis Cabot Lowell. Francis Cabot Lowell was born in Newburyport right about the time the American Revolution started. He went to Harvard College. He was very interested in, he made a lot of money in his own right as a merchant and a trader, but then he was interested in domestic manufacturing. So he went to England and he observed all of the really brand new cotton textile mills in England. And he basically memorized the design of the looms and the other machines in these mills. He was conducting type of espionage of trade secrets. He brought them back. He had somebody build replicas of what he saw, and they put them into operation at the building on the right, which was it in Waltham, Massachusetts. They called themselves the Boston Associates. It was a huge success. The investors were getting 25% per year return on their investment. The problem was that the Charles River in Waltham only dropped 5 or 6 feet. They needed more water power. Well, Francis Cabot Lowell died before they could expand, but his colleagues, Kirk Boot, Nathan Appleton, Patrick Tracy Jackson, knew of the Pawtucket Canal in Lowell, and they sent agents out to buy up the canal rights and all the land around it very inexpensively, because there was nothing here. There was about, as this quote says, that's up on the screen, there were only about a dozen houses in what constitutes Lowell. And that's because it really was just sort of farmland and pasture land with a couple of farmhouses. And so they bought it very inexpensively, and Lowell just exploded on the scene. The first mill went into operation in 1823. They were content to be part of Chelmsford, but they found that the selectman form of town government didn't really meet the needs of a large manufacturing community, that Chelmsford was still very rural, and there was a lot of conflict over things like building roads, bridges, things like that. And so the wealthy mill owners prevailed upon the legislature to carve out a separate new town, which ultimately became Lowell after Francis Cabot Lowell. And the original grant would be today's downtown, the Acre neighborhood, the Lower Highlands, and South Lowell. So this is a map from Google Maps, and I've just drawn this red line. This is the top half of the original grant. And you won't be able to see on here, but these boxes with numbers in them, let's call them corner points of these different chunks of land that I'm talking about. And here's the bottom half. You can see this is where the Lowell Connector, Route 3, Route 495 all come together. You can see the Concord River running south to north on the right side. And that green blotch in the middle is St. Patrick's Cemetery and Etzen Cemetery. So the first corner point, if we go here up on the Merrimack, where does this leave the Merrimack? And we're going counterclockwise. This is at the intersection of Pawtucket and Broadway. The red brick building is the Lowell Humane Society. You see the sign for UMass Lowell. That's the South Campus going up to your right on Broadway. So remember, we're going counterclockwise. So now we're going down to the southwest. That corner of the initial grant of Lowell is Cross Point. That's the big building in the background, but more precisely, it's where Route 3 and Route 110 join. And that's right where this picture is taken from. And then we head east towards the ocean, and the boundary there is somewhere on the Concord River. It's west of Woburn Street, just around where Delmont Street is. So that's the southeast corner of this box. And then it just follows the Concord River up to where it flows into the Merrimack, which is where the Lowell Memorial Auditorium is. And so that's the original grant of Lowell. And as I said, Lowell just grew and grew and grew, and soon the people in charge decided more space was needed. And so just 8 years after the receipt of the town charter, Lowell was granted a chunk of Tewksbury. It was basically Lower Belvedere. It was known as Belvedere Village. And here's a depiction of that. And you can see the Merrimack River is horizontal at the top. Concord River forms the westerly boundary of this new grant, this 1834 grant from Tewksbury. And the green down at the bottom is the Lowell Cemetery. So this is more of a triangle. Again, it goes counterclockwise. There's a familiar shot that was the original boundary. So we're now on the east side of the original boundary at the auditorium. This is the railroad bridge that's at the intersection of Billerica Street and Lawrence Street. If you look underneath the railroad bridge off to your right, you see kind of a green fence. That's Lowell Cemetery. To your left, where those cars are parked, just beyond that is the Concord River. So this is on the east side of the Concord River. And again, this is the southern boundary, the corner number 2. And corner number 3 is the Merrimack River. And it's right about, this is Pawtucket Street looking south. So if you drove up Pawtucket and kept driving straight all the way to the Merrimack River, that's where that corner of the triangle is. And so 3 is like opposite Pawtucket, 2 is Billerica Street and Lawrence Street, and 1 is at the Lowell Memorial Auditorium. So that's the 1834 annexation from Tewksbury to Lowell. 1836, Lowell has grown so quickly, the legislature grants it a town charter. That did not affect its geography at all. It just made it, I think it was the 4th city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. 1851, what we know as Centerville, which originally was called Central Village, was annexed from the town of Dracut. So here we have another triangle. You can see the reservoir up on the hill, and you can see the Merrimack River is the southern boundary of it. So we have 3 corner points again. Number 1 is Aiken Street at the Merrimack River. There's Top Donut. That black pickup truck looks like it's heading towards the Willette Bridge, which is sometimes known as the Aiken Street Bridge. The corner point 2 out in Dracut is at Methuen Street at the Dracut line. And corner point number 3 is Duck Island, where the sewage treatment plant is. So that's this 1851 triangle that was taken from Dracut and affixed to Lowell. And that's what it looks like from up above. 1874 was a big year for growing Lowell. There were 3 different annexations. 2 of them were on May 18th. The first one was from the town of Chelmsford, and that included the Upper Highlands and Middlesex Village. So here's that triangle. Now we're going to reverse the direction and go clockwise. So that first symbol is going to be where the Humane Society is, in the UMass Lowell South Campus. 2 is Cross Point. So there's the Humane Society. That's the northeast boundary of this new area. Cross Point is the southeast boundary. Then we're going to head due west to Drum Hill in Chelmsford. So Westford Street at the Drum Hill line, right where Lowell Ford is. That's the extent of this annexation. And the 4th one is right around where the Rourke Bridge is at Pawtucket Street. So that's this box. Again, 1, the South Campus, UMass Lowell, 2 is Cross Point, 3 is Drum Hill, and 4 is just to the west of the Rourke Bridge. And that was 1,174 acres. It was also a part of Dracut was annexed. And this was a big area. It includes today's Pawtucketville and the rest of Centerville. So that's what this looked like. I needed 5 points to identify this. And this one goes clockwise. Number 1 will be the Aiken Street Bridge. Number 2 will be Pawtucket Boulevard at the Tyngsboro line. Number 3 is Varnum Ave at the Tyngsboro line. And we'll get to what 4 and 5 are in a minute. But this was almost 2,200 acres. And you can see that the other part of Centerville where the reservoir is, that's already part of Lowell. So now all of the rest of this is joined to the city. So again, Aiken Street to the Pawtucket Boulevard at the Tewksbury line. Then we go inland to Varnum Ave at the Tewksbury line. And then we go straight eastward till we get to Willard Street and Humphrey Street. Willard Street is a fork off of Bridge Street. If you stayed on Willard Street and you got into Dracut, you'd get to the Shaw Farms restaurant. And then it comes back to Methuen Street at the Dracut line. Again, that's the look of that piece of land. Now, in 1874, there was a smaller area of Tewksbury annexed, and then there was another one in 1888, and they were adjacent to each other, and they were both relatively small. And so I've depicted them on the same map, and we'll treat them together. And that's much of Belvedere. So you can see that the first one from 1874 was 210 acres, and 1888 was just about the same amount as that. The corner points are going to be, so we start at Pawtucket at Andover Street, and then we go east to Buttman Road. And we follow Buttman Road all the way to Rogers Street. And then we kind of go cross country to Boylston Street at the Boston and Mayo Railroad track. That's the Frank Grady Bridge. And then we go back to this familiar spot at Billerica Street and Lawrence Street. So that's the new, that's what the entire area is. So this line from 2 to 3 is Buttman Road to Rogers Street. And then we cut through to number 4, which is Boylston Street, and back to 5, which we've seen before on the Concord River. And so then the last annexation from Tewksbury came in 1906, and that included the rest of Belvedere and a neighborhood called Wiganville. And it's sort of an oddly shaped area, but, and I used 6 points to mark this. And it was about 1,100 acres of land. So number 1 is, again, it's the Merrimack River, but if you came out Putnam and went straight towards the river, that's where the starting point of that would be. It goes all the way out to the river at the Tewksbury, today's Tewksbury line. And then it cuts back to Rogers Street at today's Tewksbury line. Then Boylston Street at today's Tewksbury line, just where the Bunting Club is. And then Woburn Street at the Tewksbury line. And then back to Rogers Street at Putnam. And then number 6 is the Billerica and Lawrence Street. So that big area was annexed in 1906. And so these are the different annexations through time and the amount of acreage that each consisted of. So the mechanism for annexing land from one town to another is pretty straightforward. The state legislature votes for it, and if they pass it, it happens. It doesn't happen a lot now, but back in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, it happened with some frequency, especially as cities started growing and they carved out part of the area of the more rural towns that surrounded them. And what was the attitude of the people involved? Well, I found a newspaper article from 1901 from the Lowell Sun that I'd just like to read a short part of it, because I think it raises some of the issues involved in annexation, kind of the political and the quality of life ideas. And in this case, some people wanted to annex all of Tewksbury, the entire town, to Lowell. And it's because, quote, lower Tewksbury residents are fearful that the annexation of Wigginville means the later annexation of Andover Street and Atherton, the town's most valuable district, and are now agitating to annex the entire town. Now, Atherton is the area around Colley Stadium, and across the street from that on Roger Street, that was actually kind of a big manufacturing area back then. And then this article goes on to say the Wigginville annexation covers an area of 1.2 miles in a thickly settled district. It comprises Wigginville, Gilmanville, Riverside Park, South Lowell, and Boylston Park. Because of the heavy settlement that has occurred, the quote, present sanitary convenience is inadequate to its needs, unquote. Tewksbury cannot provide sewer and water. The benefit of this to Lowell may be to allow some who live in now congested areas of the city to relocate. Almost all residents of Wigginville favor the annexation. So it almost was like a win-win, because the people who lived in these areas were not going to get clean town provided water from the town of Tewksbury, nor were they going to get sewerage, but Lowell was doing that throughout the entire city. And so I think the hope of the people in these bordering communities was that if they became part of Lowell, these at the time modern conveniences would be extended to them. And on the same token, in Lowell, they wanted additional area because the existing parts were very heavily populated, and there was a lot of crowding, and it was seen as a way of allowing people to spread out a little bit and have safer and better housing. And so that seems to be the prevailing attitude. I've seen similar things for some of the annexations of Dracut, or some proposed annexations that didn't happen. So it really wasn't like people were dragged kicking and screaming into the relationship. It seems like it's something that worked for both sides. So that's really the extent of my presentation. I don't know if Robert can jump in and
Yep, I'm here, Dick.
Questions.
Absolutely. So we have several questions already, and I would encourage those in the audience to type your questions into the chat. I promise we'll get to all of them. You sort of already touched on this one. This one came in a little early, but I'll have you answer again. Christopher wants to know, did the towns resist the annexations at all? And if so, why were they not successful?
So I mean, I will give the caveat that I've not exhausted all of the resources that might disclose that. I'm getting there. I'm working on it, but I've not found it. As I said, it seemed to be a mutually beneficial thing. One of the things that the actual bills that passed were very clear that the people from the leaving community owed taxes right up until the date they left. I don't know if you've paid attention to some of the details when you bought a house, or the last time you bought a house, but they do that. They prorate the real estate taxes right up to the day of the transfer of title. And so that each owner pays his or her appropriate share. Well, back then, the legislature was very concerned with the town not getting cheated out of any revenue by the people who were leaving. So I think there was kind of a respect of both the rights of both the city and the town. And I think this sort of carries over into the talk I'm going to be giving on Halloween for the Lowell Historic Society that Bridget mentioned. Some of Lowell's political problems were that they were spending a lot of money. Sewerage is very expensive. And of course, the people getting elected were happy to spend that money and hire a lot of their constituents to work on the projects and provide jobs for people. But that's one of the things that caused a lot of friction within Lowell that led to things like charter changes and some pretty bitter electoral fights. But I'll save that till October 31st.
What a tease. And I will say that I really know how to pick dates, because I guess that the Lowell Historical Society is holding their monthly meeting tonight of Old Nightstick. So I'm sorry that some of those folks couldn't be here with us, but they did ask for the recording. So I will make sure to forward that along. Mike asks a similar question. What enabled Lowell to take the other town's land, and didn't the towns resist the takings?
So yeah, I think the first two questioners, along with me, bring a 21st century sensibility to this issue. I guess if we went and petitioned and surveyed the residents of Tewksbury and said, would you like to abandon your town government and come be part of Lowell? My guess is they'd probably say no, because they're probably content with where they are. But I think it was different 100 or more years ago. And I think the city was a great place. The city had all the new things. The city had all cultural things. You didn't have a car where you could jump in and drive somewhere. And you certainly didn't have 500 channels on your smart TV. And so for entertainment, culture, employment, all those things, you came to Lowell. And I think by becoming part of the city, you maybe had a better chance that the streetcar line got extended to you. And as I said, the sort of infrastructure things that we sort of take for granted now, but in an age of diphtheria epidemics and other things and waterborne illnesses, those were really big deals.
All right, we do have some redundancy in some of the questions, so I will skip a few. Frank wants to know, when you talk about sewer, was that just directing wastewater to the Merrimack River? Because I don't believe they had wastewater plants at that time.
Yeah, that's correct. I think they believe that the flow of the water would sort of break down the pollutants. And I think as bad as the kind of sewage from your house may have been, the stuff that the industries were dumping into the river far surpassed that in terms of the hazards. A huge issue in Lowell was safe drinking water. In fact, that great big annexation of Pawtucketville, that was in some respects driven by the need to obtain well water. That a lot of the water so there was a very elaborate project. I mentioned the reservoir up on Christian Hill a couple of times because it was so prominent on the map. And Lowell had this huge project where they pumped water from some of the, first from upstream before it passed the mills in Lowell, but also from some of the wells in Pawtucketville, all the way across Pawtucketville and Centerville, and then up into the Christian Hill Reservoir. So yeah, there was no Duck Island sewage treatment plant back then, but that was almost like the least of their problems.
Christopher asks, why could the towns not provide the services, and why would Lowell residents not just move to the suburbs?
So I think the towns could provide the service, but it was cost prohibitive for them. You didn't have miles and miles of subdivisions, and even if they're on 1.5 acre lots, that's still a lot of houses. Back then, you just had a lot of widely scattered farms, so it made no sense to incur the cost of digging up your streets and laying pipes and all the engineering that went into that. And as for why people in Lowell didn't move to the suburbs, I suspect there might not have been a lot of housing, and the people who would have wanted to move couldn't afford to have houses built.
So Pat has a specific question. Was Clark Road in the 1906 annexation? Isn't the oldest cemetery of Tewksbury off of Clark Road?
Clark Road was part of the 1906 annexation. And there are a couple of old cemeteries in Belvedere. I'm not all that familiar with them. I'm kind of the tour guide of Lowell Cemetery, and when I was in high school, I cut the grass at St. Patrick's Cemetery more times than I care to remember. So those are the two cemeteries I know the most about, but I'm not yet familiar with some of the colonial era cemeteries in Lowell.
Well, one of your former Lowell Historical Society members, Kim Zanino, used to give tours of some of the Tewksbury cemeteries. So Pat has a follow-up question. This is related to one of the first slides you showed. Part of Tewksbury is called Wamasett. Did the Wamasett Indians live here? Was the Powwow Oak a prayer place of the Wamasett Indians?
So the actual grant of Wamasett was only for land west of the Concord River. But the Native American village of Wamasett straddled the Concord River. It was on both sides of it. In fact, Fort Hill, which is a prominent terrain feature, got its name because it was a Native American fort. It was built to protect as a defensive position against other Native Americans. It existed before the English came here. So that was the Wamasett village as opposed to the town charter. It didn't extend out into today's Tewksbury. Now, maybe after the 17th century, somebody decided to name a part of Tewksbury Wamasett. And I remember, I think it was the Wamasett Drive-In was at Route 495 and Rogers Street. I'm kind of dating myself, but I don't remember. I've not come across from the 17th century another place called Wamasett. And what was the second part of the question, Robert?
Let me see. I already checked it off as answered. So let me
Okay,
scroll back to it. Was the Powwow Oak a prayer place of the Wamasett Indians?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know much about other than its recent history of the Powwow.
Yeah. Well, what I will say, Pat, who asked that question, is stay tuned, because hopefully sometime in the next 3 to 6 months, as part of this Tewksbury history series, we will have some sort of talk on the history of Native Americans in Tewksbury. So we'll get your question answered then. Susan has a good question. Was the reservoir at the top of Harvey Street built by Lowell after it was acquired from Tewksbury, or by Tewksbury before it was acquired by Lowell?
Well, the reservoir that was on Fairmount Street was built by the mill owners, and it was really part of a very elaborate fire suppression system. It was essentially intended to power a sprinkler system for the mills. Lowell was sort of a leader in firefighting and fire insurance, and that's because of all the money that was wrapped up in these very flammable buildings. Even though they're made of brick, the stuff that was inside them was very flammable. So I don't know exactly when that reservoir was constructed, but I don't know whether the land was in Lowell when that reservoir was built, or whether it was Tewksbury and later became Lowell. But it was neither the town of Tewksbury nor the city of Lowell that built that. It was privately built by the mill owners.
Sierra lives on Bishop Street. Is there any information on how the streets in this area, such as Bishop, Brunswick, Calvin, Berwick, got their names? And did any of the streets change names after the annexation that you're aware of?
One of my book aspirations is a book called Naming Lowell, and it's to kind of identify where all the street and place names came from. And the reason I want to do that is because it doesn't exist yet. So I don't know where many of these streets got their name from. I will say in the Registry of Deeds, when you go back through subdivision plans, you might find that like up in the Highlands off of Stephen Street, you might see that Mr. Jeunesse owned a lot of land and divided it into building lots. And sure enough, there's Jeunesse Street right in the middle of it. And so often the street names came from the owners. And as for whether the names changed, they didn't change because of the annexation. They may have changed over time. For instance, in downtown Lowell, what we know as Market Street, which becomes Salem Street, originally was Lowell Street, but that became Market Street at some point. But if there were any name changes, they weren't caused by the annexation.
Brian asks, did the New York streets ever have a bridge that connected them?
I don't know. By the way, if people have questions about particular properties or streets, you can email me at the Registry of Deeds. The email address to use is lowelldeeds with an S at the end at comcast.net. And just put, this is for Mr. Howe on it in case somebody else gets it. And we can't drop everything we're doing to help you with your home research, but when time permits, I'm happy to dig into it, and it gives you an answer, and then it gives the answer to me in the future if somebody asks me again.
We'll take a couple more questions, try to wrap in a few minutes. Rachel asks, how did Upper Belvedere come about with all their mansions and nice houses?
Well, it was the Nesmith brothers were the kind of the real estate developers of that area. And if you're familiar with the park called Kittredge Park, that was originally called Washington Park. And the subdivision plan that breaks up that neighborhood into building lots actually has hundreds of trees drawn on it. And so the Nesmiths were trying to attract a wealthier group of individuals to live in that neighborhood. And I think they were able to afford to hire architects and builders to construct the beautiful houses there. I will say, just kind of an observation about Lowell, the really wealthy people who owned the mills didn't spend a lot of time here. They still live mostly in Boston. They sent their money here, but they hired this kind of managerial class to manage their interests here. And between that group and a lot of people who just started out with nothing, but became very wealthy, like Freeman Shedd, he became incredibly wealthy through selling cologne. Frederick and James Ayer, they became incredibly wealthy through patent medicine, as did Charles Hood, who owned much of the land in Tewksbury that became Belvedere. Because these people didn't have like ancestors who had lived in Boston ever since the Puritans were here, they were content to put down roots in Lowell and really contribute to the community, both through business, but also charity and politics and things like that. And so that's one of the characteristics of Lowell. The people who built and lived in those big houses, more often than not, they started with nothing and they made their money through their hard work and ingenuity. So in that, it's sort of like it's actually the American story. They're not the people that inherited multi-generational wealth.
Wayne says, thank you for this event. And our final question, I'll say, will go to an anonymous attendee who asks, which annexation in hindsight was the most consequential for the city of Lowell, in your opinion, in terms of economics, politics, demographics, or any other area?
I can't single out any one. I think cumulatively they're all very important politically for this reason. And one is that if Lowell was just its original grant of downtown, the Acre, and really the Lower Highlands and South Lowell, what would happen is it would still be an entry point for immigrants and people who come into cities, who work. And so what happens is when somebody does well and they're able to afford a house with a yard and sort of more breathing space, they want to move out of the inner city. Because Lowell has all of these neighborhoods, they move to Pawtucketville, or they move to the Highlands, or they move to Belvedere, but they stay within the city and they still contribute to the city by sending their kids to the schools, participating in politics. If it was only just that core inner city, the people who made some money and were able to afford a house would be living in Chelmsford or Tewksbury or Drake. Not there's anything, certainly not anything wrong with that, but they'd be living in the same place they're living now, but they'd be part of a town. They wouldn't be part of Lowell, and they wouldn't be contributing to the Lowell government. So I think that's why I would answer adding these sort of suburban style neighborhoods to the core inner city cumulatively strengthened Lowell more than any one of them did on its own.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dick. We've hit 8 o'clock. I think you've answered about a dozen questions. So why don't we wrap here? Do you have any last words for the audience before we end?
No, it's been delightful. Thanks for sticking with us. And I look forward to my next opportunity to talk with the Tewksbury Library.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dick. Wonderful job as always. Thank you to my counterpart, Bridget Coley, in the Pollard Memorial Library for helping promote tonight's event. I also want to thank Nancy Reed and Doug Sears over at the Tewksbury Historical Society for all their assistance as well. And I hope to see you all at a future event. Definitely make sure to check out Dick's Lowell politics, Lowell. Let me get this right. History of Lowell Politics on Halloween at 2 o'clock through the Lowell Library and Lowell Historical Society. And then for you Tewksbury folks, make sure to check us out on Tuesday, November 9th at 7 o'clock for the talk on the history of the Ella Fleming School here in North Tewksbury. So thank you all so much, and everyone have a great night. Thanks again, Dick. Thanks, Bridget. Bye-bye.
Bye.